It is the spring of 1944, and a B-24 Liberator is making its final approach over southeast Michigan. The pilot peers down through a thin layer of cloud and sees, spread across the flat farmland below, the unmistakable geometry of a small American town. Neat grid streets, parking lots, a water tower, houses, row after row of modest, identical houses stretching toward the horizon. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. He banks the aircraft and continues on his way. What he does not see, what no one flying over Ypsilanti Township is meant to see, is the building directly beneath those houses. A building so vast it has its own postal code. A building that, at full capacity, produces one complete heavy bomber every single hour of every single day. The building the pilot does not notice is the Willow Run bomber plant, and the town above it is not really a town at all. It is a secret. It is a miracle. It is one of the most audacious acts of industrial camouflage and wartime improvisation in human history. The story of Willow Run is the story of how a democracy, suddenly and reluctantly dragged into a global war, transformed itself with a ferocity and scale that its enemies had catastrophically failed to anticipate. It is the story of a car factory that became a city, a workforce that had never seen an aeroplane that built over 8,000 of them, and a piece of Michigan farmland that quietly, invisibly, changed the outcome of the Second World War. To understand why Willow Run had to exist, you have to understand the problem that confronted the United States in the months following December 1941. America was not prepared for war. Its military aviation capacity, measured against what was needed, was laughably insufficient. In 1940, the entire United States produced roughly 3,000 military aircraft. Germany, by contrast, was turning out over 10,000 per year and had been doing so for several years already. President Roosevelt, understanding that air power would be decisive, had called for the production of 50,000 military aircraft annually, a target that most serious industrialists privately regarded as a fantasy. The aeroplanes being demanded were not small or simple. The consolidated B-24 Liberator was a heavy four-engine strategic bomber, weighing roughly 17 tons fully loaded, with a wingspan of 33 meters, nearly 500,000 individual parts, and an assembly process of extraordinary complexity. Existing aircraft manufacturers, Consolidated Douglas North American, were already stretched to breaking point. The methods they used were those of highly skilled, experienced craftsmen, working by hand in small workshops with long apprenticeships. You could not simply scale craft production. You could not hire 2 million aircraft workers and expect them to build as well as the men who had spent decades learning the trade. What was needed was a different approach entirely. What was needed was Henry Ford. Ford's engineers had spent 3 decades perfecting the moving assembly line. The principle that workers should come to the worker, not the worker to the work, and that every task should be broken down into its simplest possible constituent operation. They had turned the making of automobiles into something that an untrained person could contribute to within days. The question, in 1941, was whether the same logic could be applied to something infinitely more complex. An aircraft built to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, from materials that behaved nothing like steel stampings, assembled in configurations that changed with every model improvement. Ford said it could. The government was not entirely convinced, and the aircraft industry was outright hostile. Builders like Consolidated, who had spent years developing their expertise, regarded the idea of a car manufacturer mass-producing their precious designs with something approaching contempt. But the mathematics of the situation left little choice. On April 8, 1941, 8 months before Pearl Harbor, because the people running America's industrial planning could already read the direction in which the world was moving. Ground was broken on a new facility at a place called Willow Run on the Huron River in Washtenaw County, Michigan. The site had been chosen for reasons that were partly practical and partly defensive. It was inland, away from the coasts, making it harder to reach by enemy aircraft or submarine-launched saboteurs. It was close enough to Detroit's existing automotive workforce to draw on a pool of semi-skilled labor, and it was flat, spectacularly, uselessly flat farmland that offered nothing to the eye but unlimited space and cheap acquisition costs. What the Ford engineers designed at Willow Run was, and remains, one of the largest buildings ever constructed. At its completion, the main assembly building measured roughly 488 meters long and 162 meters wide, nearly a kilometer of floor space under a single roof, covering approximately 130,000 square meters. To put that in some kind of human context, if you placed 8 American football fields side by side, you would just about fill the main factory floor. The roof sat on 1,600 concrete columns. The structure consumed more steel than several small warships combined. The production line itself was an engineering feat of breathtaking ambition. A B-24 Liberator, on its journey through the plant, passed through 14 major assembly stages. Wings were built separately from fuselages. Tail sections arrived as sub-assemblies. Engines were run up in test cells before ever being installed. At the far end of the line, where the building made a dramatic right-angled turn, the famous L-shaped bend forced by the county border that Ford had not wished to purchase, a Finnish bomber emerged, rolled out onto the tarmac, and was handed to a test pilot for its maiden flight. The sound inside the plant was said to be continuous and physical, a low, dense roar that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears, produced by thousands of machines running simultaneously, by the impact of rivet guns, by the scream of cutting tools on aluminium, by engines being tested in the far bays. Workers communicated by gesture and by expression. Those who stayed for months reported a kind of sensory adaptation that made silence, when they returned to their homes in the evenings, feel strange and somehow threatening. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The workforce that filled this building was unlike any that had ever built aeroplanes before. At peak production in 1944, Willow Run employed approximately 42,000 people. Of these, a significant proportion were women, drawn from the farms and small towns of Michigan and Ohio, from cities, from households where a husband or brother had already gone to war. They became riveters, inspectors, assemblers, machinists. The image of Rosie the Riveter, the iconic poster figure in the bandana and rolled-up sleeves, was partly inspired by women exactly like those who worked at Willow Run. They had no prior experience of aviation manufacturing. Within weeks under Ford's training system, they were contributing to the production of aircraft that would fly over occupied Europe. The housing question was severe. Willow Run sat in rural Washtenaw County, miles from any town large enough to absorb tens of thousands of new workers. The federal government, through the Federal Public Housing Authority, eventually constructed Willow Lodge, a complex of dormitories and temporary housing units adjacent to the plant that became, in effect, a city of its own. At peak, roughly 14,000 workers lived there. The complex had shops, medical facilities, childcare centers, a cinema, and a postal address. It was, by any definition, a community, one that had not existed 2 years earlier and would not exist 2 years later. assembled out of urgency and steel and raw American logistical will. Above all of it, the houses and the dormitories and the vast grey roof of the plant itself, the camouflage architects went to work. The Army Corps of Engineers oversaw a program of visual concealment that extended to the rooftops. Nets, artificial vegetation, and painted surfaces were used to break up the geometric regularity of the building from the air. Fake roads were painted on roofs. Dummy housing structures were added to blend the industrial facility into the residential landscape surrounding it. The effect, from altitude, was of an extension of the neighbourhood. More houses, more streets, more of the flat suburban America that a Luftwaffe navigator, had one ever made it this far, might conceivably have dismissed as irrelevant. In practice, no German aircraft ever flew over Willow Run in anger. But the camouflage reflected a genuine fear that existed in 1942 and 1943. A fear that the industrial capacity being assembled in places like Ypsilanti was itself a strategic target, as vulnerable to disruption as an oil field or a railway junction. The secrecy was total. Workers were discouraged from discussing their employment. The scale of the facility was not publicly known. Press access was tightly controlled. To the outside world, Willow Run was, officially, just another factory. By the time production reached its peak, the numbers had become almost hallucinatory. In August 1944, Willow Run produced 432 B-24 Liberators in a single month, more than one every 2 hours, around the clock. Over the entire course of its wartime production, the plant delivered 8,685 completed aircraft, along with tens of thousands of knockdown kits shipped to other assembly facilities. No single facility had ever produced heavy bombers at anything approaching this rate. The German aviation industry, for all its engineering brilliance, could not match this output. Neither could the Japanese. The sheer, relentless, unglamorous volume of American industrial production was itself a weapon, one that wore down the enemy not through a single decisive blow, but through a tide of material that could not be stopped. Germany's own attempts at rationalizing bomber production were hampered by the competing demands of the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht, by the disruption of Allied bombing campaigns against their own facilities, and by an industrial culture that prized craftsmanship over volume in ways that proved, in this particular conflict, to be a fatal disadvantage. The He-177 Greif, Germany's primary heavy bomber program, produced fewer than 1,100 aircraft over its entire production run, plagued by engine fires and design compromises. Against Willow Run's output, the comparison is stark and unforgiving. The legacy of what was achieved in that flat corner of Michigan extends in several directions. Technically, Ford's methods at Willow Run demonstrated that genuinely complex aerospace assemblies could be produced on a moving line by semi-skilled workers, a lesson that the post-war aviation industry took to heart. The principles applied in Ypsilanti in 1943 echo, in modified form, in the production lines of Boeing and Airbus today, where sub-assemblies arrive from across the world to be joined in a sequence that would have been recognizable to Ford's engineers. The social legacy is at least as significant. The women who worked at Willow Run, and the African-American workers who found a factory employment there in numbers that would have been impossible in the pre-war segregated labor market, discovered capacities that the pre-war world had never offered them the opportunity to exercise. Some of them never returned to the domestic roles the 1930s had prescribed. The workforce assembled at Willow Run was, in miniature, the beginning of a different America. The physical plant itself survived the war and passed through several industrial incarnations. Kaiser Frazer built automobiles there. General Motors produced transmissions. For a time, it seemed as though the building might simply be demolished, too large to easily repurpose, too complicated to maintain. A campaign by local historians and veterans groups eventually secured the preservation of a section of the original factory. The Yankee Air Museum now occupies a portion of the site, and within its walls you can stand on the original floor beneath the original roof trusses and try to imagine the roar. It is very quiet now. The birds have returned to the fields around it. The housing that once crowded up against the camouflage nets is long gone. What remains is a building, patient and enormous, that once produced a bomber every 60 minutes for the freedom of the world, and which even the pilots who flew those bombers never quite knew was there. The city that wasn't a city, the factory hidden under a neighbourhood, the weapon that looked from the air exactly like nowhere important at all. That was Willow Run.